I'm the organizer for Jews for a Secular Democracy here in Michigan. Jews for a Secular Democracy is a pluralistic initiative for Jews, all denominations, any denomination, no denomination, and also friends and family members who care deeply about the growing influence of religious fundamentalism on government policymaking. So while there are many excellent secular organizations that deal with the separation of church and state, and there are also many excellent organizations that deal with the separation of church and state, and that Jewish organizations that deal with social justice. Jews for a Secular Democracy is where those two get married, and where we are specifically focused on issues of religion-state separation from a Jewish perspective. In Michigan and around the country, there are efforts being made to ban abortion, to limit contraception, and to divert private money to public education. So if you're wondering why we're combining those today, these are currently the topics of ballot issues here in Michigan, and also ballot issues and legislative efforts across the entire country. So what do these issues have to do with church and state? How do they impact the Jewish community? And how are these seemingly unrelated topics related? What does Judaism have to say about them? These are the questions that we're going to be grappling with tonight. You should have all received an index card, okay, and a pencil. So this is to ask questions throughout the event. If you have any questions, please write it down and submit it to Stuart. Stuart, stand up and raise your hand. And also Linda, who is here in the back. And they will be wandering around. If you want your question picked up, just kind of wave it. If you are joining us on Zoom, which we have many people on Zoom joining us, please write your question in the chat. We have somebody who will be transcribing your questions and will be giving them to Rabbi Joyrich and Rabbi Falik here. I will be asking the first 3 questions, and then we're going to move to get as many audience questions as possible. I'm asking the panelists to limit their responses to 3 minutes. I'm so sorry because I can't remember your name, is going to be our timekeeper. He's holding up a green card when you still have time to go. The pink card he's holding up when you have 30 seconds left.
So no one hold up your index cards.
Oh, that's right. That's right. The index cards are also pink, so we'll try not to get confused. At this time, I want to acknowledge our sponsoring organizations. In addition to our panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute, we have Rabbi Jeffrey Falik from the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, and Rabbi Miriam Jarris from the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And we also have from National Council of Jewish Women, we have Linda Levy and Kathy Cantor and Lynn Lieberman, who are here, as I said, from the National Council of Jewish Women. I also want to acknowledge tonight that we are honored to have Senator Rosemary Bear in the House. If you can stand up and wave, and thank you very much. Are there any other elected officials who are here who I didn't see coming in? Okay. I want to give many thanks to the AJC JCRC, to Congregation Adat Shalom, and especially thanks to Temple Kol Ami, to the entire staff, to the Social Action Committee. And at this time, I have, yes, please, thank you. Thank you. At this time, I have the honor of introducing our esteemed panelists in no particular order. Rabbi Brent Gutmann is a Reform rabbi. He is the senior rabbi right here at Temple Kol Ami in West Bloomfield. Sadly for us, he is beginning a new position in next month as the senior rabbi of Temple Beth Zion in Buffalo, New York. So we are very thrilled to have him here for one last big event. I'm sorry. His background includes reform and conservative congregational settings in the US and in New Zealand, with a commitment to community building, social justice, and Torah learning. Rabbi Asher Lopatin is an Orthodox rabbi and is the executive director of the JCRC AJC of Detroit. He is the founding rabbi of Kehillat Chayim of Detroit and the founding director of the Detroit Center for Civil Discourse. He is a Rhodes Scholar, a Truman Fellow with an MPhil in medieval Arabic thought from Oxford University. Rabbi Blair Nosanwisch is a conservative rabbi and is the director of spiritual care at Congregation Adat Shalom in Farmington Hills. She was a board member and chair of education and social action at the Isaac Avery Downtown Synagogue. She is a co-founder of an educational initiative for Jewish teens and tweens called Peer Core Detroit, co-founder of a cross-cultural urban garden called Eden Gardens, and the creator of Pickle Torah, and you're going to have to at some point tell us what that is. At this time, I forgot to remind everybody to please silence your cell phone if you haven't already done that. And I am going to start us off with the first question. The terms religious liberty and religious freedom have become highly politicized by all sides of the political spectrum. What are the threats to Jewish religious freedom in this country? And before we get into specific issues, can you please speak more broadly to the Jewish community's interest in safeguarding the separation of religion and state? And
we had a little huddle. I think I'm going to kick us off, actually, if that's okay.
please.
I want to say first, before I address the question, just how happy I am to be on this bima with Rabbis Lopatin and Rabbi Nosanwisch. I don't know how to say that. Nosan used to be it, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, and Rabbis Jairus and Felix, thank you so much for joining us. I tried to put together a panel like this, and I'm so glad that it's happened. It's actually this combination of rabbis that I respect and admire so much. So thanks for joining for this conversation. And I think taking the end of your question first, let's start there, because separation of church and state, we all know, is a fundamental pillar of our society, but it's a pillar we should understand, especially those of us who are Jewish in the room, as one that Jews contributed deeply to in the founding narrative of our country. So I brought a couple of notes. Another Asher from some time ago, Asher Levy, was a prominent Jew who came impoverished to New Amsterdam, that today is New York, in 1654. And there were actually a couple of issues that he got involved in. One was in fighting for his right for burghership, which is essentially citizenship in the colony of New Amsterdam. And another that he fought not to have to pay a tax in order to not be called for guard duty for the city. He argued that Jews should be able to serve as guards when New York was quite a bit smaller, New Amsterdam was quite a bit smaller. And they've been excluded from this responsibility. After 2 years fighting this legal case, he won on both issues, and that formed some of the foundations in our country for separation of church and state. Another prominent example that comes close to the founding of our country is after George Washington was elected president. He went to visit a number of different religious congregations, among them the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And there, it was actually Moses Sextus, the warden of the synagogue, who stood up and gave thanks for the Ancient of Days, the preserver of men. I'm quoting here that the Jews previously deprived of their invaluable rights as free citizens on account of their religion now lived under a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And I mention that specifically because these are words that President Washington quoted back to the Touro Synagogue in his response, a letter where he guaranteed these rights of people to live according to their own religious traditions and values without facing persecution. So separation of church and state is really an essential value that we have our colonial Jewish forebears for establishing here. And it's deeply important that we protect that separation for the sake of religious liberty and for freedom of worship as well.
I want to also say I'm so excited that this is a great precedent that you're setting, and I hope we'll continue it. Rabbi Blair will continue this tradition.
You can zoom me in.
Okay, from Buffalo. really great to be here. And I want to take a slightly different direction and a more pragmatic view that Jews in America have thrived because of freedom of religion, because it hasn't been imposed. We haven't had to fight, whether it was looking the last century, communism, but before that, persecution, religious persecution. I mean, that's probably the greatest blessing of the United States for the Jewish communities, that we could be the kind of religious people or non-religious people that we want to be. And I would push it take it one more step. As an Orthodox Jew, we're all religious, everyone here is religious, but I'm traditionally observant. Maybe not, you're not religious. Okay, not everyone's here religious. Spiritual. So, so I'm supposed to say we're all religious, but okay, no, that's good. It's always the next step, next level. So, to be, I love when people are religious or spiritual or committed, and when they're fabrenta, but the whole point of America is that each person and each community can choose their own way of being religious or spiritual or observant. And so for me, it's almost inconsistent with orthodoxy or with being religious or being strictly religious to want the government to be involved in your religion. And frankly, we could talk a lot about Israel also, to keep that it might be a much better place for religion, for Judaism, if it weren't so strict in certain areas. But certainly in America, that's where, if we want to be the kind of Jews that we want to be and to thrive, we need that kind of freedom. And by the way, I love being in a religious country, a country where America's pretty, as far as going to church, a very high compared to Europe. People, maybe it's the puritanical tradition or what it is. People are going to church, they're going to synagogue, they're going to their mosque, they're going to their temples. I love that. And I love going into churches and going into mosques, and now with this Hindu temples, it's all great. So I want to encourage that when people want that. But the way to do that, I think, is to take the government out of this kind of, out of religion. And that's the way to make it a more religious and a more successfully religious country, and individuals more religiously successful, by keeping the government out of things.
So I'll use one of my seconds to say it's Nosanwisch. Confused. I don't want everyone to be confused. So I have nothing to disagree with. I'll only add 2 extra pieces of fodder for the discussion. One thing I was thinking about in approaching this, I was like, well, if I really explore this question, the thing that actually comes up for me is, I don't think that our tradition would say in its own voice that it is against that it's for the separation of church and state. That in one sense, the flourishing of Judaism would be having access to being able to legislate even certain domestic and communal norms. And I think that it's important to name that, to say we actually benefit greatly as a minority being in a country that doesn't allow that. And I think you were starting to get at this, Rabbi Asher, where you're saying in Israel, in a Zionist project, it is a very different conversation about the separation of church and state. And so I actually feel, as an American Jew, really committed to the thread of moderation that the separation of church and state requires of all of us. And the other piece I wanted to bring was actually taken quote from a former classmate of mine, a high school graduate who ran for governor, Abdul El-Sayed. And he was the first Muslim to run for governor, and maybe the country, but specifically Michigan. And he said, as a Muslim, I benefit greatly from the separation of church and state. And any minority should feel the same way. And I was very struck by that. I thought it was a very clear analysis, and I felt I too agree with that as a Jewish American, that I benefit greatly from the separation of church and state, even when we come from religions that in and of themselves, in a microcosm, actually do have ideas that might want to express themselves on the political stage. They're not apolitical traditions always. So those were the things I wanted to add.
Could we comment on
Yes,
each other?
please do.
Rav Blair, I mean, Rav Blair brings up such a great point that if you read your Bible, you know, it is the society that the Torah wants to build. You get stoned if you don't keep Shabbat, or you get stoned if you don't, all sorts of things. And so it's a great challenge. And you talk about Israel, and I think that it's interesting that the Jewish tradition, religion has evolved. And then you got into a different period in the period of the rabbinic period. And I actually think that the great mistakes that our people have made was not being inclusive, being too strict with maybe the early Christian Jews, maybe with even the Samaritans. And so I think it's interesting, our religion has evolved, but it's a great challenge, you know, when you're looking at an ideal separation of church and state, why would Jews be so passionate about separating things? Pragmatically, you can understand, but even ideally, but I think when you look at the evolution of Judaism, you get a much more favorable attitude towards separation of church and state.
And that we benefit from it, and we can connect ourselves with other minority experiences in benefiting from it, instead of thinking of it as some innate Jewish value. It's like, no, actually, we're sacrificing something because we can see that we benefit much more from this.
Go ahead.
I'm being asked more. Well, you know, I think it's an interesting study to look back at the Bible and see the system of governance that was set up there. And certainly when we get to topics like appointing leaders for ourselves, the passage of the Kings, that there is room in there that allows for that evolution that is so important. Judaism is not static, it develops over time. And so, you know, when we hear passages that say things like, when a day comes, you want to appoint a king for yourself, you shall appoint a king, that is both selected by the people and sanctioned by God. And that passage has been used to justify systems of government set up through the ages by Jews. And at the same time, it allows for us to develop a much freer, more open society, maybe a more ideal society that saves us from some of those persecutions, those anti-Semitic situations that our ancestors faced earlier.
But we love the Queen. God bless her.
All 70 of her years. Okay. So there are two issues that we want to focus on today, both of which are currently being fought out in the courts, in the legislature, and in the ballot initiatives, which is reproductive freedom and the use of public money for private education. So we're going to start with reproductive freedom. Nationally, as it seems that the Supreme Court is poised to overturn Roe versus Wade. And here in Michigan, we have a ballot initiative that would enshrine reproductive freedom, including abortion and contraception, in the state constitution. That's people are currently collecting signatures. In fact, there are people collecting signatures in the lobby as you enter. So my question for you is, what does Judaism have to say about abortion and about contraception? And are there denominational differences here? And how about if we start with you, Rabbi Lopatin? Okay,
thank you. You know, it's interesting. I think within Orthodoxy and within Orthodox rabbinic opinions, post-game decisors, there is a huge variation. And even though there are different sources you can point to, I think that everyone would agree within Orthodoxy, certainly, and I imagine the other denominations, that if the life of the mother was at all threatened, that, and this is, you know, backed up by so many sources, Talmudic and Maimonidean and you know, medieval, that you save the mother and you sacrifice the fetus. And it's fascinating that that's not what the Catholic religion believes. And so certainly, even from a full consensus within Orthodoxy, that in that case where the mother's life is at all in danger, that you have an abortion. And in fact, there's a chiyuv, there's an obligation to end that pregnancy, to save the mother. you clearly see how if the state is going to impose its will in a certain way, that could be very problematic. Now, I understand that let's say Rav Moshe Feinstein, the greatest Orthodox decisor of the previous century, of the 20th century, he did see at least abortion later, late term or after 40 days. He said it's killing. I got to say that he said it's killing. Many modern Orthodox, my rabbi, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, said it was not, and really said if a woman feels that she can't deal with this child for emotional reasons or whatever, that she could definitely abort till even the 7th month, even late term abortion. But even according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, who felt that what is going on with abortion is really killing human lives, still, in order to maintain our individual religions, we have to say that we have to keep the government out of it. And there will be people doing things that we disagree with as Jews. There will be people worshiping idols in America, but we can't set up a system that the government restricts them, because then, as we mentioned, the government's going to restrict Jews from doing certain things. So it's a fascinating situation that within Orthodoxy, there's again a variety of opinions, and one decisor might say, no, you cannot have an abortion for that reason. For, let's say, it's mental health. Though many believe that mental health, the mental health of the mother, you definitely can have the abortion. But whatever the disagreement among the decisors, the last thing you want is the government to get involved and to force some kind of decision. So as much as you might want a society where there's no idolatry, or where everyone supports this, or everyone is that, the most important thing is to enable us all to live as individuals and to make those individual choices. So whereas, again, there's a spectrum of opinions on abortion within Orthodoxy, also, I don't understand how any Orthodox leader can be in favor of the government getting involved in abortion rights.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
So to add to that, one piece that I was thinking of being important to establish is that our sources are, in my perspective, pretty clear that life does not begin at conception. And that's a divergence from where Catholicism takes the exact sources. There's actually even like a translation difference from the Greek Septuagint to our Hebrew, where a specific word is thought in the Greek to mean that it is the fetus is fully formed versus a woman being harmed. I'm not getting into the specifics, but like a literal Hebrew word gets translated differently in our tradition and in the Christian textual tradition. That's a really big point of divergence. That said, I also think that it is valuable to be able to name that there is loss of life in an abortion. It's an emotional experience for people who have to choose to have an abortion. And so I think that it's honest to be able to say, and still it's a person's choice over their body. And I do feel very strongly that the whole debate that we're having about not allowing people who have fetuses, who carry them to term, to make decisions about their body is largely about women's rights and autonomy. And our tradition, I think, in a lot of ways is more favorable to women's autonomy in that matter. There are a lot more sources that would say mental health is a totally viable reason, and that a baby is not a fetus until it's literally emerging in labor. It's not a life until it's emerging in labor. And so even if you're not there emotionally, our textual tradition would support a pretty liberal view. And the other piece that I thought it is important to name is this aspect of the government legislating about when life begins is a spiritual, emotional, belief-based question. And I know very few people who are pro-abortion. This is not the debate that we're having. And it is so vital that we be able to separate that out.
Thank you. Rabbi Gutmann.
I just want to start by lifting up those comments about bodily autonomy, and that, there is a tendency within this discussion of taking that autonomy away from women. And I want to lift up that you raised that point, because I think it is so deeply important. And when people are anti-abortion, they often make the suggestion that a choice to abort a pregnancy is something that's being done trivially, or is something that's being done on demand, right? It's something that's being done thoughtlessly, and I think that opinion is degrading, because no one who makes a decision to abort is doing so trivially. These are decisions that are painful. These are decisions that there's grief that results from it. These are decisions that need counseling, which follows it. And so I think that is the thing that we're really fighting, that there are deeply held values and beliefs that are underpinning the Jewish priority placed on the existing life, on the life of the mother. I'd take that also and say the lives of other siblings. If you have a mother who can only support in their household so many children, and here's another child, and it's going to upset that homeostasis, then that needs to be preserved. And just, I've got to mention this, because I've got a wife at home who's watching our children that's a Jewish bioethicist, and spent a year while I was studying in Israel, working at the Ministry of Child and Maternity Health. And there she worked specifically on a case set directly relating to this conversation, wrongful life and wrongful birth cases, which we don't even really have in the United States. This is a situation where someone can come forward and argue and say, either the child that I gave birth to, or me myself being born, was such a mistake that I am owed compensation by the physicians, by the medical establishment that failed to recommend an abortion.
Wow.
So it goes very extreme. And by the way, her work there contributed to the passage of a law that created a panel for review. And so these cases have found a better way to get resolved. But just to give us a sense of how differently this issue is being thought of, they're at the complete other end of the continuum.
Wow, I never heard that.
Well, now you have to ask Joe.
I will. If you could all just take a moment and comment. You talked about what Judaism says about abortion. Does Judaism have anything to teach us about the use of contraception? When it is or isn't appropriate is.
But we could start with, it's a mitzvah to have children. It is also a mitzvah to raise healthy children, and to be able to make sure, we'll get into this soon when we're talking about education, but to bring healthy individuals into this world. And so in terms of a means of family planning, Reform Judaism certainly embraces contraception, definitely is a solution that's less harmful than waiting until an abortion is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I'll only add that our tradition says that you've fulfilled your requirement if you've had 2 children, and maybe that's still too much for some, I get that, but our other piece that is important to say is the mitzvah of procreation only falls on men in our tradition, not on women, because having children is dangerous. So you are not commanded to reproduce, because reproduction itself is harrowing, and the rabbis recognize that. And so within that, I mean, I would think, I personally get very uninterested in legislating into people's personal practices, and think that contraception is a very healthy practice. And if our tradition sources don't line up with that, which I believe they do, I don't even want to know. Like, I'm like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. Thank God. So that's my take.
I mean, there is a source that is in the Talmud about, and it's taken from a verse from Kehillat that continue to try if you've had the minimum requirement to continue to try. But even in Haredi, ultra-Orthodox circles, contraception is practiced. There's a discussion about which ones to use and which ones come closer to destroying seed and whatever. But definitely, in fact, one Haredi ultra-Orthodox rabbi, when one of his students came to him and just his wife had just given birth, whatever, less than a year before, and he said, I want to have more. She said, what gives you the right to think that you can go ahead and not practice contraception? So even in the ultra-Orthodox world, this is so different from the Catholic world, and maybe some evangelical circles, I don't know, but definitely it's exactly what Rabbi Blair said. And a healthy sexual life and a healthy family life, that is what pru'ervu means. That's what being fruitful and multiplying is. Ona, the way a husband and a wife treat each other and care for each other in a sexual way and in all other ways. So therefore, contraception is definitely part of that.
Thank you. So I'm sure that when we get to audience questions, we'll come back to the topic of reproductive freedom, but I'm going to switch the topic. There are currently efforts all over the country to establish systems of diverting public money to pay for private education, including religious school. Some of these come in the form of vouchers, which actually vouchers are unconstitutional according to the Michigan State Constitution. But in Michigan, there is currently a ballot measure that would allow people to donate to private and home schools instead of paying state taxes. Many Jews, including my own family, would benefit financially from a tax structure that diverted public money to pay for private education. My own children attended Jewish religious school. And we know much of the organized Jewish community does support and value Jewish day schools. Yet the breach to separation in church and state seems clear, let alone the damage to communities whose funding would be diverted through these measures. Are our Jewish values or interests in conflict with our American values on this issue? Or are there Jewish values we can draw on that can help us clarify this position? And I'm going to start with, who didn't I start with yet? I'll start with you. Thank you.
So I struggled with this one a little bit more. I felt very familiar with the issues of reproductive rights, and I also think that there's some real tensions here. So I wanted to talk about this from two sides. One piece, I was thinking about a Talmudic principle from Sanhedrin that talks about what a Jewish community needs in order to be like a legitimate Jewish community. And the list includes a Torah scholar and a court and a synagogue and a bathhouse and a teacher of young children and other things besides. A mikveh is famously on the list and something you should do even before you build a synagogue. So that's one vision of what it looks like to have a whole community. And this is an ancient text. I don't think they're talking about secular versus religious education. I think they want a space where Jews are being Jewishly educated. That is a vision of taking care of community. And depending on how we define ourselves and how we see ourselves in relation to our broader cultural and communal context, it is actually a really interesting question of if you feel that your tax money should go toward your parochial interests. On the other hand, I was driving here, so I don't have the source, but I remembered this story that I thought was very telling, and for me is more instructive than that first piece. There's a story of a person who's just come into some property and they're really excitedly clearing their little stone path in front of their house, and they're throwing the stones out of that path and into the public thoroughfare that is alongside it. and someone stops them and says, what are you doing? You're moving things from land that you do not own to land that you own. And the person who's clearing the stones is like, you doofus, what are you talking about? I just bought this house, it's mine. Like, I'm getting the stones out of my way. A couple months later, they come into some misfortune, they lose their property, and they're walking along the public path and they trip over the stones that they removed. And the light bulb goes off, and they understand that actually to invest in the public sphere is to invest in oneself. I think that is such an important principle for us, especially as a religious minority. If we disinvest from the public sphere, and this is happening in so many ways and in so many places in America right now, the disinvestment from the public sphere into private sphere and imagining that the private sphere will care for people like the public is supposed to. I fear it greatly. It's actually one of my deepest concerns. So though I'm sympathetic to the idea of tax monies going towards, monies going into parochial education, I think the deeper value for me is this piece about investing in our public sphere.
Thank you. Rabbi Gutmann.
Yeah, I was thinking of examples as well, and the thing that jumped into my head is the passage where they're discussing the Talmud Lo Bashamayim. It's not in heaven. You know, this learning is very near to you. And talking about what is that about? And one of the examples they come up with is that it's actually a commandment to teach your child to swim. It's actually a commandment to teach your child to have those basic survival skills in this world. I love the example that you brought up with the stones, and that, you know, triggered another example in my mind, which is the man who gets visited by Elijah the prophet until he builds a gatehouse that separates his own property from the property of the community. So there's something that's damaging to the redemptive process in the world, actually, when we cut ourselves off from that public need. And I think this is where, you know, the issue of education and the priority we as a Jewish community put on Jewish education really turns into an issue of justice, because these specific voucher programs that you know, are being discussed in these various initiatives, they are allowing individuals to divert money from the public sphere towards their own children. There are children who potentially attending the public school that don't have this option of a private education. They're going to receive less as a result of others choosing more. And so I think in terms of, you know, where the reform movement stands on this, it's unequivocally in the position of supporting public schools. This was very important in the post-World War II era among Reform Jews as a decision to invest in, to send your children to public schools, to be exposed to people of different cultures and different backgrounds and different faiths. But more than that, in the era of desegregation, to recognize that many of these efforts to set up private systems of education were aimed specifically at avoiding those mixed contexts, avoiding that my children are going to interact with children from the inner city or wherever it is that we could disparagingly point to. And so I wanted to actually bring some language. There's a number of Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Rabbinic Union resolutions that have been passed. So I brought a couple of these. Here in 1998, the Central Conference of American Rabbis wrote, "We resolve to continue to support public education. We support prioritizing public education, reducing public school class sizes, addressing public school infrastructure problems, supporting choice where others are disadvantaged aren't disadvantaged as a result, creating a safe and positive classroom." And really the most important part of this resolution is one that addresses the question of charter schools, of other schools, where it says, "We resolve to continue support for public education by cautiously supporting the charter school movement and other forms of creative education as alternative options within the public schools, provided that all such programs are established for a specific educational objective. They're subject to proper administrative and curricular oversight and regularly auditing their results. They're available to all students at no cost to the individual family. They are non-sectarian, they are not-for-profit, and sixth, finally, they adhere to the same standards and guidelines in civil rights and religious liberties as do other public schools. And you can hear in that last point the driving concern at what these charter systems and what these vouchers are doing to our society.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think, and I've, talking to Carol, who's on our executive committee about this when we were coming in and struggling with it. Talking to my wife also, like, how am I going to answer this? How am I going to, thread this needle? Because Orthodox in general, the Orthodox community, for a great extent, send their kids to private schools, to Orthodox schools, or to Schechters. I think for me, I think the thing to avoid is looking at easy money and thinking that with vouchers, not in Michigan, but with vouchers or with using tax money, diverting tax money to Jewish schools, it looks like easy money. It looks like, wow, this is a way of solving our problems, of getting people to attend day schools when they're not. And it's not a way of solving it. It's a delusion. And money, we've known from the Bible, is very tempting. And when there's easy money to be had, it's very tempting. And so, and I think that the results, I know Milwaukee, I think in Wisconsin, there's, I think, either vouchers or there's a really hefty subsidies for Jewish day schools. Not too much, it doesn't change things so much. So it's very tempting, but I think if you look at it pragmatic, both sides, certainly the argument of diverting funds from public schools is a major problem, and should be a problem for Orthodox Jews as well. But also pragmatically, if you start getting the government involved in schools too much, then you're going to have to please the government. Now, the other side of that is, if the government wants to get involved in Jewish day schools, and they do to some extent, responsible for our kids' education, then the government has to help them. So there's sort of a balance here that you want, I would think Jewish day schools want to keep their independence, so they should not be tempted by this pot of money from taxes or vouchers or whatever. And likewise, the government has to realize that if they are going to get too involved in Jewish schools, they're going to have to step up and they're going to have to show some kind of support for these parochial schools. And finally, what I want to say is that I think there's a temptation in general, and the public schools should not be too tempted by money that they think automatically comes in, and they have to step up. And that's why I think charter schools are a good idea. People should be competitive. No one should take this money for granted. It should go to quality public education, but it really needs to be quality public education. And I think the Jewish community and the Orthodox community has to constantly prove that day schools are great, that our kids are happy at their day schools. And so I think that having this easy money might be to the detriment of day schools, of Jewish day schools, because they're not going to have to hustle as much to prove that they have a good product. So let's hustle to teach our kids more and not go after easy money.
Before we take questions from the audience, and I do want to remember, I'm getting some in, but if you have questions, raise your hand, fill out your index card, and Stuart or Kat or Linda will pick them up from you. Is there anything that the three of you would like to add in response to something that was already said, or anything that you want to add at this point before I go to audience questions?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to this last piece of our conversation, because one thing that's coming up for me is, and this is actually part of what you were speaking to, about the imagined other in the abortion situation, who is like reckless and careless and making this decision out of some sort of levity. I think that our country is suffering in general from an imaginary other. And I think when we talk about like public school, it's like we've just gotten very far away from seeing that is literally our legacy. Even if we choose to do something else for our children, and I grew up as a public school kid who's now got my kids in day school context, and I'm question it and think about it all the time. But I actually do feel really strongly that a piece that is happening beyond the Jewish community, but broadly in our country, is just this inability to imagine that we are all in a social compact with one another. Even though we have all of our differences and all of our specific and particular needs, those needs are not they're not the only things that are going on. And if we're going to share a society, we have to actually believe that like our government is us, and that our government should be caring for everyone. So that's something I'm thinking about, and it's not anti to.
I hope you get the faculty discount to the Hello.
At Hill.
I mean, I'd add coming here, I was serving previously in Auckland, New Zealand as the rabbi before coming to this particular congregation. And the structure of their school system was very interesting. New Zealand has a big emphasis on equity and justice, and their motto for the country for a long time was building a better British society. So as a result, they actually create a tiered system that favor less affluent communities before more affluent communities. With the Jewish day school that's in Auckland, it's called Kadima. It is a public-private partnership where they're receiving money from the government and then providing anything that's Jewish studies, anything that's extracurricular on top of that. But I want to bring that up with contrasting how differently we think of education and how elitist education is made in this country. I think someone heard a long time ago that X number of presidents come out of Yale Law School, right? There's a very small set of higher education institutions that provide virtually all of the upper echelon leadership for our country. Contrary to think about the school of choice system and what the effect of that is for us in Michigan, that when parents decide to school of choice their child out of a particular district and into another district, money is actually allocated away from that district into the district they're going to, which means that those families, like for example, think of families in Pontiac that don't have the resources to be able to maybe drive their kid to West Bloomfield to make in school of choice. That school system is receiving that much less from those that leave, and then those that stay have by default that much worse of an education because it's supported that much less with resources. I just and I'm saying this as someone who's been here for only 6 years, be insulted by a passerby or however you take it, but I really think the whole system of education in the state of Michigan needs to be re-examined.
Brent, this is going to be an interesting idea. Maybe taking some of these funds, giving some funds to private schools, religious or otherwise, but those funds have to be used for integration programs between private schools and public schools. So in other words, when you are bringing those, where they'll go into a fund that subsidizes bringing Hillel kids, FJA, Farber kids, to Pershing, to Cass Tech, to elementary schools, and really incentivizing connecting us, because it's something amazing when you see it, when there are these flickers of hope, when there are mixing, and I think it's to the benefit of both groups. So maybe that could be a little bit of a compromise, helping out the day schools a little bit, but only in as much as they are going to make sure that they know that they're in the same society, they're in one social compact with all the kids in this area.
So you may have answered this enough already, but I'm going to ask this to see if there's anything you want to add to it. If public money is given to people for parochial education, then what will happen to our public schools? So we've been touching on this, and if you want to have if any of you have anything to add to this.
If public money is given to our.
If public money is given to, did I misspeak?
No, I just.
If public money is given to people for parochial education, what will happen to our public schools?
Yeah, I don't know that there's.
I mean,
more
they'll
to say.
suffer. We've got to
Yeah.
decide if we want public schools.
Yeah,
And I think we have to change the way, how communities support their schools, like maybe through, make the state, not through property taxes, and some of the things you mentioned,
that is
so
a
that
good
the-
point.
again,
Some
it's
of
a-
the way we allocate.
right, so allocation has to be, and maybe more federal allocation. So I think, in other words, to balance poorer communities and wealthier communities. And that might be even a bigger issue than this allocating money to parochial schools, about how we equalize the amount of money that goes into teaching each student.
Here's a question, and I'm gonna have this one go to you first, Rabbi Lopatin. What about forcing yeshivas to teach a secular option based on your comment that the government should get involved with Judaic education? What do you think about the requirements for secular education in Jewish schools?
Yeah, I think, I think that's so critical. Now that you have to, it's cheating these students, and look, society does have to look out after children. We have to protect children. So that is an area. We disagree with the Catholic Church about when someone's considered a child, but certainly when our society has accepted that when someone is born and is alive in this world, they need to be protected. So I think that's as far as protecting the children. And yes, that has to be balanced about not having the government totally take over yeshivas, but children need to be protected. They're vulnerable. And I think that's a legitimate place for the government to get involved.
Like you're saying, protecting them is giving them.
Is
some
giving them,
secular
yeah,
education,
enabling
just
them
making
to
that explicit.
know English, to know math,
Mhm.
the very basics. Look, I guess you could make the argument, well, the government will force them to lead a certain kind of life. I think that really the only reason these schools are not, I don't know, I don't want to get into a soapbox against the schools that are not teaching them math or English in order to control them. But I think government, that is a legitimate place for government to protect children. Once they're maybe 16 or something, they can choose, they can just study, and give up secular studies. But as kids, it's only fair that government protects them and provides them, forces schools to provide them with that kind of education, with some secular education.
Anybody have to add to that? Okay. Next question. I have been taught that the law of the land is the law. What value takes precedence in our Jewish values that are not consistent with the law of this land?
So what Jewish thing that we hold is counter to the law of the land?
Yes.
Does anybody have any
Well, let me
I
give
have
a
a
technical, I'll give a technical answer,
Yeah.
and Rabbi Blair, you'll give a much better, deeper answer. But the technical thing is that when the rabbis talk of dina de malchuta dina, that the law of the land is the law, it's just referring to financial law. It's just referring to how you have to pay tax, you have to, in finances, you can't cheat, you have to follow the systems that were established. Dine mamonot, monetary expenses, not other laws, like if the government says you have to work on Shabbat, if the government says you have to worship in a certain way, then you don't follow the government. And we have a long tradition of that, of resisting the government. But when it comes to monetary law, the government establishes what is fair and what is cheating, and we have to observe that.
It's not even always the law. Sometimes it's social structures that are put in place. Redlining that happened as a societal practice, but also in ways that Jews in previous generation were barred from working in certain hospitals if they were Jewish, or teaching at certain universities if they were Jewish, or having certain professions even if they were Jewish. And so I think it's something that we need to be careful about. Certainly, yes, Dina de Malchuta refers more to whether or not I'm going to pay my taxes to the Roman government when they come to collect their tithe or whatever it is. And then, conversely, we can have the discussion about what tithe do I owe to the the temple if I'm paying to the Roman government because there's a deduction in there. See, Jews invented taxes, invented all this stuff. I don't know, that might be something we don't want to put out there as some sort of, I think as well, when we think about government, though, government and the structures that are there, if we live in a democracy, are determined by the majority. And that's also something that's under threat in this country because we're increasingly moving into an era where
You've muted the panel. We can't hear it.
so, someone on Zoom said something about something.
That you
We're
can't
good.
hear-
The panel got unmuted somehow, but it's good now.
Okay.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Okay, we're back. We're back.
I don't know if this is helpful to add. The two things that I thought of that are like practices that are important to us that could be controversial and that we would, I think, make sure we had religious protection. I'm thinking of circumcision and shechita. Like you could certainly imagine, I think these are conversations more for European Jewry right now than American Jewry. But yeah, I could imagine an environment where if we lose some of our separation of church and state values, you start to see questions about, oh, well, it's the tide has turned. It's no longer ethical to shecht, ritual slaughter in that way. So those are things I've thought of in that vein.
And I would just add that Judaism should be countercultural. And, I'm embarrassed that in 150 years ago, when during slavery, 200 years ago, that the Jews of the South, there were exceptions, but in general, they lived with slavery. They weren't like the Quakers that were all opposed to it or some other Christian minority denominations. And I wish that Judaism, the Torah, that the Talmud would have instilled with us that we can't tolerate that. Now, I think, thank God, Jews have been at the forefront of civil rights with helping the Black community as partners of the Black community and other rights and other movements. So I think when we're not countercultural and we have to check ourselves and we say, are we really being the Jews we're supposed to be?
So I'm going to move on to another question. This question could be the topic of an entire evening. There's a movement to control education regarding US history and policing language about sexual identity. What is the Jewish position? Now, I just want to point out, I quoted the questions. I worded it just as the questioner asked it.
I think that we come from a tradition that is more interpretive, more open-minded intellectually, that is like a cornerstone. Now, I was raised actually Reform, and the one thing I got from Reform education, not saying the only that was available, the one thing I internalized was that there was this value of asking questions. And I often have had people come to me or find their way to Judaism and say, the thing I was so excited about was that it was safe to ask questions. So to me, any learning environment that makes conversations and ideas off limits is toxic and dangerous and deeply anti-Jewish values.
Thank you.
I think as well in answering the other part of the question about how we feel that certain labels are controlled and sexuality and these descriptions that kavod habriut is a real cornerstone of Judaism as well, respect for human dignity and really being able to respect each person for who they are. As the other is my favorite philosopher would say, Emmanuel Levinas, or to have an I-thou relationship, as Martin Buber would speak about, that really the thing that our tradition has honed, that our rabbis have tried to hone, is kavod, is giving kavod to others. Who is the one who is honored? Who is the one who has status? The one who honors others. And so similarly, from the Jewish tradition, there is no valid argument for denying another person their identity. They need to be given it as they see themselves. They need to be offered the chance to express themselves.
Yeah, I think that in addition to what I wrote is Tselem Elohim, a similar kind of idea that everyone has the image of God within them. And B'Tselem Elohim Bara Oto, our commentators say that each individual has an individualized image of God, and it's not like we're all the same. Each one is their own image of God and should be different, and we should celebrate that rather than wanting to be everyone to be the same. That's sort of the story of the Tower of Babel. Also, we want not everyone to speak the same language. My son Judah, who's pointed out to me that Maimonides says that you have to address someone by their own name. You can't call someone by a nickname that they don't like. And my son's interpretation, right. So part of respect is if someone wants to be addressed as they or she or he or whatever it is, then it's a chiyuv, it's an obligation from the Torah to call them the way that shows respect to them. So, these things sometimes, because of prejudice, you're not doing what's required religiously to show that kind of proper respect.
I want to add something to this because it's connected to something else that you had shared before, Rabbi Asher. I think sometimes that I love what you said about Judaism being countercultural, and yet religious communities tend to be conservative. And that really, it confounds me actually, because I experience spirit and like being a person of faith as a very deep imperative to justice and to countercultural values at times. And maybe Rabbi Falik can resonate with this a little bit. I sometimes find myself having to differentiate the spiritual and the religious imperatives. And there's like no question in my mind that God loves us exactly as we are. And religion tends to get scared about what the future will look like, but I don't think that that's inherent to our faith. I think that that is human culture, and religion becomes a place where we can act that out. But it's not authentic religion to be conservative. That's human need to control. I'm susceptible to that.
No, I'm gonna have you all back for another panel on LGBTQ issues, and we'll fly in for it. Okay, this is a question, I believe, for you. Where does it say that it's a mitzvah to have 2 children?
Well, so when it says pru or vu, then the liturgical and rabbinic conversation around that tries to figure out, well, what do they actually mean? How much do I have to multiply? It says pru or vu in Bereshit, in the beginning of the Torah, and it's talking about the first command to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. And then when the rabbis legislate it out, they figure out, okay, well, you'll recreate yourselves, one male, one female, you're fulfilled on your obligation. There's much more to say about that.
So are you fulfilled if you have two daughters or 2 sons?
I suppose.
I tried really hard.
We live in a progressive enough era that we can have a very broad understanding of sex.
I mean, there's also in that discussion voices that creep in that are alternative. I think it's Ben Azai who says, I'm not going to have children because others in the world aren't there enough to have children for me. And so it's not taken as universal. There are other ways that we relate to the generation. This is, I think, something important that hasn't been stated yet. Torah texts relate to children as our guarantors. They are our hope for a future. They are the individuals that we have, the opportunity to look on and say, you're going to make a better world. Even when I'm gone, you're going to still be working on making a better world. And those relationships, as we look to be fruitful and multiply, can also be relationships of discipleship. They can also be relationships of teacher to student. In fact, the word for parent has the same root in Hebrew as the word for Torah. It's Horim, Torah, same root there, right there in the word.
Yeah.
In fact, in this week's portion of Bamidbar, Rashi mentions, it talks about Moshe's kids being Aaron's kids. Moshe had his own kids, but the children of Aaron's are Moses because, and Rashi right there, the commentator says, because he taught them. And if you teach Torah, if you impact someone, Kehillat Yelado, it's as if you've given birth to that person. So absolutely exactly what you say. And I'll just say one quick thing, because Shavuot is coming up, and the Torah describes that the sacrifices mincha chadasha laHashem. Bring a new offering to God, and that's where we are. We have to be. I know there's a fear of change, and there's a fear of, if you do this, the whole religion is going to collapse. If you take out God, the whole thing is going to collapse. And we can't be afraid of new thinking. The holiday which celebrates the giving of the Torah, Shavuot, is the holiday that God says, I want something new. I don't want just something the same old, same old.
Thank you. So are rabbis nationally or statewide forming strategies to raise a united voice on support for abortion rights? For example, an open letter addressed to the SCOTUS, to the POTUS, to Congress, or to the State House or State Senate that could appear in the New York Times or Fox News or somewhere else. Is there an effort to do this?
I think NCJW has really led the way of trying to organize the church to them again and again for their sources and their leadership and guidance. And I also want to say, I think that, and I was thinking about our parsha this week too, because it's all about all these leaders and the way that leaders are appointed. And we are also told that we are a nation of priests, right? That we are a nation of leaders, I was thinking. And I think that it is important for people in positions of leadership to speak out, but it can't stand in for everybody being active on these issues. And I'm so sick of signing statements. Like, I don't find it meaningful or powerful. I'm willing, but it's so inadequate. And back to the quick fixes of the schools, like, I got off social media. I've been off for over a year. It's the best thing I've ever done for myself, because it has forced me to work so much harder to be in touch with people. And I'm thinking about that a lot as I think about what's necessary going forward. And I think it's brave to take public stands, and this does not feel like it should be a particularly controversial issue within the Jewish community. So I'm all for that piece of it. But I want to get away from the thing that's going to solve this is the leaders doing something. We are all actually impelled to act, and we're capable. And I'm seeing NCJW do amazing things. So just, if you want to act, turn to them. They're doing it, and we'll do it with them.
And if you're in this room and you haven't signed the reproductive rights petition yet, make sure you do it before you leave today. And others.
I'm in agreement.
When you work,
And I've signed.
thank you. When you work in interfaith spaces or coalitions, do you hear similar church-state concerns from Christian clergy?
It's a good question. Go ahead.
The first story that popped into my head was when I organized a concert in New Zealand, and we went into this massive Anglican cathedral, and we're going to have this Jewish music concert in this space. And the person who was booking came up afterwards, and we did our tour and said, how'd you like it? What do you think? And I said, it's beautiful. The acoustics are beautiful. Just one small issue. There's this big cross at the end. And you think you could remove that? And he literally, I'm quoting him, he looked back at me and said, what's the problem? Don't we all believe in the same Christ? I think when you are the majority, when you are the elephant of the society, so to say, not talking about any specific, well, maybe I am. You don't have to think about the others as much. You're not living in the shadow of them where you have to be careful and watch out. I think our Jewish experience historically have taught us that the way to be Jewish and to survive is to not be mediocre. We have to, as Jews, be exceptional. We have to, as Jews, try harder. We have to, as Jews, be smarter, because that is the way that we can make sure that not only are we safe as a people, but we're able to keep other minorities safe.
You know, it's interesting that I think that differently evangelicals, they feel that government's being very oppressive and not letting them be the evangelicals they want to be. It's a fascinating narrative that I don't think they would put it in terms of separation of church and state, but I think they would say the government is you know, overbearing. So I wonder whether we could you know, marshal some of that feeling. We in the the Jewish progressive world, let's say, whether we can marshal some of that anger against the government and show, you know, even the evangelical community and maybe the Catholic community that, yes, we have to really make sure that this country does separate church and state. So it's so interesting that, you know, they're you know, that they feel, when you talk to people way on the right, Jews and non-Jews, they feel, you know, the country is in terrible state and it's falling apart. And then talk to people way on the left, and we feel, you know, that what's going on, Roe v. Wade, we're going back 50 years. And so there's a consensus on that. It's just kind of have to fine tune how we can work together.
Hearing you talk, I was thinking, we should have some sort of council on community relations. I don't know. Has anyone thought of that idea? I think, you know, it's interesting to hear your idea, Rabbi Asher, about Jews advocating for this, because often when these issues come up, the most powerful mouthpieces for us are Christians. When we can find our Christian allies, because, you know, for whatever reason, they're able to speak up and their bias isn't questioned in the same way or whatever it is, they become much more effective advocates. This was, you know, Rabbi Training 101. A long time ago, I was a student rabbi in a little congregation in a place called Petoskey. You might have heard of it. And the very first issue that emerged there, before I actually even got on the ground for my first Shabbat with the congregation, was that there was this movement of people, Tea Partiers, and one of them had been elected to the school board, and they made a proposal that the name of the holiday break be changed from holiday break to Christmas break. And you know, this was really alarming to those in the Jewish community. I'm sure, you know, Muslims or other religious minorities that are up there would have felt the same way. But the way that it was approached was not through us as Jews using our own voices, but looking for allies out there who could help to amplify our message, and, you know, could help to make it clear that not all Christians support making Christianity hegemonic in the country.
I'm going to ask the last question, and I greatly apologize if I didn't have time to get to your question. My last question is, how do we take what Judaism teaches us about these issues and transform it into advocacy? How would you suggest that we bring our traditions approach to abortion and education into the national conversation?
I'm gonna get on my soapbox again, actually, because I feel, actually, the person who said this to me is the son of someone in this room. Where is Schadenfeld? Your son, Peter, said to me a long time ago, and I never forgot it, that he's like, people in this country are obsessed with national politics. It's crazy. Like, local politics matters so much, and we get completely lost in the national. And I'm not saying that what's happening nationally is unimportant, but again, all of our technology, all of the messaging that we get in society makes the world so big and so unapproachable and so unmanageable. And the wisdom of the right has been to focus on school boards and local elections and all of these things. And I maybe could assume that this is a politically normative space, but I'm a conservative rabbi, so I never assume that there's a politically normative space. But I do think that that was a very wise move to understand that change actually happens interpersonally. Things are going to get legislated on the national level. They're going to get argued and changed, and it is going to affect us. But actually, we and our interpersonal relationships are the thing that matters the most. And the more that we can think locally and the more that we can think small, the deeper impact that we'll actually have. And that is, I haven't felt very inspired by politics and political movements much lately because everything has been so big and so nationally focused. So that would be my soapbox for this question.
I mean, I would say that education is really, really important as well. Not education in the sense of funding public education like we were talking about, but the kind of education where we're able to have a conversation and educate ourselves about, what does our own tradition say about these topics? So a lot of Jews are not aware that the conversation we're having up here, as much as we might have come up against political topics, this is a religious conversation. We're talking about these topics from our perspective as rabbis, using the text of Torah. Judaism is not impartial when it comes to these issues. Judaism has a voice, and we should not be bashful about sharing that perspective. I'd also say, in addition to being able to have those interpersonal relationships that Blair just talked about so eloquently, that working together, teamwork is also vitally important. There are lots of organizations and lots of groups that are advocating for these issues. And when we're able to work with them, we're able to accomplish more together. The reform movement has taken the initiative of establishing certain centers, both nationally and on a state basis, social action groups that have worked to try to affect both local and national politics. We've taken children from this congregation to participate in a lobbying program in Washington, D.C. At the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Chayim. And it's an opportunity to make it personal as well, because these students have the amazing chance to meet their legislators and to present them face to face with a pitch on their issue, why it matters to them, why it is an issue that matters within Judaism, and what specific action they want to see that legislator take to protect their religious freedom.
I agree with everything said here. And we're different denominations, but we're like, we all agree on a lot. I would say that the question of abortion rights maybe needs to be really prioritized. I mean, there are a lot of issues. And at JCRC, AJC, we deal, immigration. it kills me that we're not letting in immigrants. We need immigrants here. We need more. And then gun reform, just yesterday, criminal justice, there's so many issues, and education. I do think that it might help really honing in on abortion rights. I just can't, and letting leaders maybe that are to the right of us, in the Haredi world, in the ultra-Orthodox world, in the evangelical world, maybe, I don't know, in the Catholic world, but let them know how dangerous this is and how, what kind of society we could turn into that with women, and dying because they're getting illegal abortions and all that. So I'm just wondering, maybe we could prioritize that issue. And the polls just came out today again, that it is people, want Roe v. Wade to remain. I mean, that's not going to happen, I don't think, but people maybe want this legislative abortion right. So maybe if we really prioritize that and let the leaders of other denominations, other movements, other religions know how dangerous this could be and wake up, then maybe we can move the needle as far as electing candidates that are for reproductive rights.
Thank you. I'm sad to say that we are almost out of time. This has been the start of a very important conversation that needs to continue. There are serious breaches in the wall between religion and government. And I urge all of you to please join Jews for a Secular Democracy. In the coming weeks, I will be reaching out to you. In the meantime, I urge you to go to our website, jfasd.org, and also you can give us your email address. Jen and Kathy will be back out, will be here afterwards still if you didn't sign in with your email address when you came in. And you can go to our website and go to the volunteer tab. I will be, now I have all your information, I will be in contact with you all. Once again, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Senator Rosemary Bear for attending. I see that we have another, what you were talking about local government. We have a West Bloomfield School Board member, Ken Ferguson, in attendance. I'm not sure if anybody else snuck in that I didn't see. We thank you, our elected officials, for listening to this very important conversation. I want to thank again the Society for Humanistic Judaism, the National Council for Jewish Women, AJC, JCRC, Adat Shalom, and Temple Kol Ami. I want to give a very resounding thank you to our wonderful panelists, Rabbi Nosanwisch, Rabbi Lopatin, and a special thanks to my very dear friend and my partner in social justice, and my rabbi. A Jewish event if we didn't have a little nosh, so I hope that you will all join us and continue the conversation informally in the back. All of the food is kosher, by the way.
Oh, thank you. And can you just take a photo of mine? Thank you.